Okay, let's dive back in. Hey, good afternoon, friends. It is still Monday, October 7th, and I am still that developer dad. And I'm still working on that application. I'll just drop a little thing into the chat that explains what I'm doing in general. And last week, we got the UI sculpted into a state that I'm actually pretty happy with. And I went away for the weekend, hung out with a bunch of nerds in Savannah in a Airbnb. There's like 20 of us crammed into 2 suites. It was a good time, a little rainy, but that's okay. We had fun, and it was hectic enough that I didn't really come back refreshed or with a plan for the week or anything like that. And this morning I started working through all these darn compiler warnings that come up when I build and run the application. And I was like, you know what? I should really take these seriously. These guys. Right now it's only showing 6. There were closer to 50 when I do the full thing. So I started working through these warnings and adding tests and so on along the way. So let's keep going. So converting null literal or possible null literal to non-nullable type. So the shuffler, that's converting a null literal or possible null value. Okay. So what do we do to fix this? We know it's being passed in up in our constructor. And we know that these are non-nullable values here. So I'm wondering why that's behaving the way it is. So shuffler is not null. It's not a nullable type up here. So what is going on down here? So selected species, pick one, maybe returns a null value. If the deck has no cards, this value may be null. Okay, so I think we want a default value here. Now, how could we possibly get... What if I come into the implementation? Pick one. No, let's not start messing with that. As far as species choices, species rules.list. I think we need to go into the implementation of this. And instead of returning default, I'm going to go ahead, go to the definition of iCard deck. And instead of returning a nullable of t, we are going to return a value. But I do want to account for the improbable possibility that I've got my head so far up my butt right now. The very real possibility that this array of T may not have anything in it. So instead of returning default, we're going to throw a new invalid operation exception. Cannot shuffle a deck with, cannot shuffle an array with 0 elements. All right. No, that's not descriptive enough. The provided deck had no items in it. Cannot choose one from none. That's better. Okay, so we've got that. And out here in our townsfolk manager, do we have any kind of try catch? We don't. So how do we account for this? Down here, throw new exception, something very dumb happened. And here we go, something very dumb happened. And that's not great. That's not great at all. And this is actually happening inside that obsolete method. So rather than spend any time messing around in here, I think we're just going to comment this guy out. We'll come back and delete it in a few minutes, but we're going to comment it out for now. And I'm going to over does not implement interface member, blah, 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 blah. Okay, good. So let's go to the interface and actually find the one that's expecting the dictionary. And comment this guy out too. You're going to want to keep those, the feature and the step definitions set. I don't think we need townsperson right now. I'm going to comment those. And something's going to break when we build. So let's rebuild. And while that's happening, I'll take a sip of coffee. I'm certain that we're going to run into a compiler error because I'm invoking this method, or I'm trying to invoke this method somewhere. And that is in the character workloads. So let's take a look and see if we can find it here. This overload exists only for the console application. I have one reference to it. iCharacter workloads, it's taking in that dictionary of string. All right, let's first, what the heck? We'll comment it out here. Save. That's going to give me a compiler error about iCharacter workloads. It's expecting to see some generate townsperson with a string. I believe it's this one, generate NPC. Is that the one I did? Let's come down here. No, where is it? Describe. We'll find it. Here it is. Generate NPC taking in a dictionary of string. That guy, this one, needs to go bye-bye. There we go. We'll save. Now let's try rebuilding again. I want to make sure I'm not calling it from anywhere. Might as well get rid of these obsolete tags here because I don't want to be fixing compiler warnings in methods that are going to be going away anyway. All right, so we build. Can we run? Let's make sure we can run. Sign in. Go here. All right. Come in here. There's the blinky cat. Do, 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 do. Come on, you can do it. The SQL database obviously went back to sleep between this morning and now. Here we go. And I want to go in a new NPC and just roll the dice a couple of times. The provided deck had no items in it. Interesting. Very interesting. Where are we in our execution? Let's take a look at the call stack. Set appearance attributes. Complexion. Aha! Okay. So the template. Okay, so we're dealing with a Dragonborn here. And shuffler, pick one. Complexion color is string empty. So what does this tell us? So what's happening here is we're trying to apply the species template, and we're trying to set appearance attributes for a complexion for a species that doesn't really have a complexion because they have scales instead of skin. Like we've got integument color, integument style, and we don't have any options in complexion on that template. So what do we want to do in this situation? I don't think we want to account for it here in the appearance attributes. I really don't want to have to alter things throughout the stack to take care of this situation. What could I do in my deck simulator so we can just continue here? All right, stop. We know this creates an issue here. So excuse me. How could we handle this? I mean, the temptation to just let it keep returning null is very, very real. But just throwing an exception there, it really does feel untidy. Thinking. You know what? I got to go back to returning null or letting this return a nullable. Default. Yeah, that's what I have to do here. And where's my interface? Come back to the interface and allow this to be nullable. There. That's the only elegant way I can do it without getting absolutely ridiculous with all kinds of other stuff. Now let's close character workloads because I'm not focusing on that right now. Save, we'll close template workers. And let's come out to Townsfolk Manager and rebuild the solution. Okay, it's complaining about test methods, workload provider, project. I want to focus on Townsfolk Manager, but not Townsfolk Manager tests or Blazor client or anything like that. Let's just see current project. And that's rubbish. I know we've got null reference warnings here. Okay, so that's allowed to be null. That's fine. Remove and sort those unneeded usings. We can collapse this. Collapse that. This one we can collapse because we have eliminated the use of the deprecated stuff. Good. Generate townsperson from options. I really don't believe that it's in an appropriate state. I want to rebuild that project. Okay, so that's going back to string.empty. Species template for selected species. Okay. Huh. All right. It looks like we got them all, but that's really weird. We'll go back to entire solution, and I actually want to find that commented out slop that I got rid of here and just fully delete it. Goodbye. Save. Come to the townsfolk manager. Delete this. Oh, goodness. What am I doing? Just get rid of it. Get rid of that. Okay. Get NPC options, load, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Save. And I think we're in a pretty good spot here. Creates a new towns person using any options supplied from the end user and choosing randomly for those options that are not supplied. Save. Boop. Retrieves the dictionary of options that are used. Okay, good. Save, load, and filter. And these ones just do the raw random generation. All right. So let's close out of the townsfolk manager. Though we created some tests for this generate townsperson where it's fully random. I think I want to add some tests for when we pass in the options. So let's come over to our feature. Scenario, user provides some selected attributes. Given the townsfolk manager is ready to generate NPCs. And I'm going to happy path this guy. When the user requests an NPC with elf as the species, Then the generate townsperson method will return a non-null value, and the return value will be a townsperson instance. And let's go ahead and grab all of these. And the return value species will be elf. Save. Now we need to generate these steps. We'll just copy to the clipboard. And I'm gonna come down here. Here's a range. Here's our given. When the user requests an NPC without specifying options, I'm going to paste that, our new step definitions, right in here. So when the user requests an NPC with elf as the species, first thing we got to do is create that object that's going to carry our selections. So townsfolk user options. Options equals new townsfolk user options. Options dot species equals elf. And then we're going to say generated NPC equals test class dot generate townsperson from options and pass the options. And we need to specify this as search dot true generated NPC dot species equals elf. And then the user selected an elf NPC but got an underscore generated NPC dot species. There we go. Save. And let's save this. And we'll go to our test explorer. We do need to rebuild. And we'll watch this space down here. Because right now there's only one test. We should get another one. There it is. So we'll run that test. Just that one. And it looks like it passed. So let's just run all of those. Okay, great. Hey, how's it going, C Films? I'm just adding some tests to my application. I'm doing some code cleanup work this week going through and taking out compiler errors and expanding my test classes and so on and so forth as I go. Now, this tests what happens when we pass in an elf. What if I want to test the other species and the other combinations? That gets kind of crazy. Yes, the tests are not going to be a pest. I don't really want to have to generate or type out all of this stuff for every possible combination of parameter passing, because that's bonkers. So what we're going to use is a feature that is part of Gherkin. Gherkin is, of course, the most widely used language for behavior-driven development. And we're going to use what's called a scenario outline with a data table. So what I am going to do must contain an examples or scenarios section. Steps are interpreted as a template, which is never directly run. Instead, the scenario outline is run once for each row in the examples section beneath it. You can use such and such limited parameters that reference headers in the examples table, and then the engine does some magic during compilation to do all of the replacements and all that stuff to build the actual coded tests for us. So step arguments, I want to pass more data than fits on a single line. So given a blog post named random. My refactor process is, well, first I start with looking at the compiler warnings for what I need to refactor. And I actually have a dereference of a possibly null. String.empty. Oh, what? Silly thing. Come on, don't be a pain in my neck. There we go. Assert.true. Okay. String actual species equals, I'm just going to grab this. Because having that inside my actual test expression is silly. Actual species. There we go. And instead of coming in here, I'm going to say actual species. There. That gets rid of that problem. So what I do is I start and look for compiler warnings in my IDE, and I start working through those to eliminate them. Otherwise, it's my refactor process. As I'm working on other things, if I spot something that's clumsy, but it's not impacting the work that I am doing right now, I'll drop a comment and create a GitHub issue, and I'll include the GitHub issue ID number in the comment that I add to the code, and that's the extent of my Boy Scouting. That way I can come back to it later when I'm not working on something higher priority and I'm not polluting the commit with unrelated work, which is exactly what I'm doing right now, because the feature that I was working on was modularizing and improving the CSS, and I'm doing compiler warning errors, fixes some compiler warnings, adds some tests. Now, if I were working in a team scenario, I would actually stage all of those changes that I just made and push them onto a different branch. But let's say I'm working through adding a new feature or fixing a bug or something like that, and I see something as I'm going through it, I'll make a note in the code right there that says this needs to be refactored. I'll create the GitHub issue. I'll explain my thought process. I'll explain what about it needs to be refactored, and then leave it. And then I come back later when I'm able to actually focus on doing that refactor correctly. Because I don't want to introduce changes that are unrelated to the actual work I'm trying to get accomplished. If the thing that needs to be refactored is part of or intrinsically related to the work I'm doing, that's when I'll start digging in and doing some actual refactoring. Now, what I'm doing this time around is I've done some refactoring on the townsperson manager, or the townsfolk manager rather, and I added a behavior test this morning just so that I could very quickly assess whether or not the changes that I was making to eliminate the compiler warnings, I wanted to make sure I wasn't breaking anything. So I figured, okay, let's, instead of spinning up the application and pushing the generate button a whole bunch of times and making sure it doesn't crash, instead I want to go ahead and, excuse me, go ahead and create some automated stuff so that I'll get much faster feedback, so that I don't have to remember to spin up the app and, push, roll the dice until it crashes or what have you. So I've just created a test that generates an elf who's got some career and has some random background. But what I want to do is, what if I want to create a dwarf, or test the end user passing in a vocation or a background or all of those things? I don't want to have to create a scenario for every one of those permutations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink that browser window because I don't need it. I do need this. So doc strings, I'm not worried about this. Data tables, here we go. Given the following users exist, pass to the step definition as the first argument, blah, blah, blah. So not really worried about this. And dialects and so on. What I want to do is create a scenario outline like this. So I'm going to pull this over to my other screen. And instead of this, I'm going to say scenario outline random NPCs with user selections. Let's capitalize U for user. Come out to the end. Townsfolk manager is ready to generate NPCs. That's the same. So how generalized? Honestly, that really depends on what kind of code I'm writing at the time. When the user requests an NPC with options. NPC, when the user supplies attributes when they request an NPC. Oh, dang it. If I'm writing like frameworky type code that's meant to be shared throughout the application, it'll be very generalized. When I'm writing more domain specific code, stuff that's meant to solve a specific part of the domain problem I'm solving, then I'll get very specific with it. But I do like to keep it flexible enough that, it can be easily changed. And that more goes into where the domain specific stuff lives versus where the generalized stuff lives. And I don't like to have generalized code mixed in with my specific code and so on. I tend to put those things in different assemblies or services or what have you. When the user supplies attributes in there with the NPC request and the requested species is, and then what we do is we put in a excuse me. We put in a placeholder argument. Species. Then the generate townsperson method will return a non-null value, and the return value will be a townsperson instance. And the townsperson will have their species set to species. Examples. Now I add a data table. All I do is add a pipe, say species, oops, and I'm going to say human, although I should probably capitalize these. And let's go ahead and copy, paste, 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 say elf, oops, dwarf, halfling, I might have to specify those as strings. We're going to find out. And gnome. There. Save. Now we need to generate these steps. So we'll define, copy to clipboard, come over to the definitions, People in my database who could be currently tied up to 4 different occupations. Yes, that's true. So in your scenario, you would need to structure your code somewhat differently from the way I've got mine structured. And again, that gets into, how general or specific do we want to be? And really, you got to make that call on a case by case basis. It all comes down to the use case. When the requested species is human, is set to human, the return value species will be elf. Well, that's all very silly. That's not doing what I expected it to do. Let's build. Let's see what happens. I feel like it's going to throw an error message at me. Types of type dictionary string. Doesn't match target type dictionary string. What's that talking about? Oh, yeah. Okay, whatever. I'm not worried about that yet. What did I goof up? Let's take a look. Delimited parameters that reference headers in the examples table. I bet I need to surround these with quotes. Boop. Come back out to the definitions. Pull data from the database. I look at it. The city and occupation level combined. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that can get really, really hairy. Let's delete that. Save. Come back over here. Build. I want to rebuild the test thing. Rebuild this. Now, define the step. Here we go. Copy those to clipboard. Come back up in here. Ack. Where is my when? I need to come down here and paste right here. Give myself some blank lines. String. Rename this to species. So, next step. Excuse me. Because we're going to be building up these options. I need to create a member level variable for these townsfolk user options. So we're going to copy and come up to the top of our thing here, right? And private class NPC options. We're going to make it nullable. I'm also going to add private, no, it's got to be public void before scenario. Pre-test initialize. No. Initialize scenario. And I'm going to set generated NPC equals null. NPC options equals null. Save. And before scenario. Save. Okay, so when the user requests an NPC with elf as the species, that's a redundant test in a minute, but I want to get this new parameterized version of the test set it, sorted, and running before I go in and delete any of that, any of those redundant things. So NPC options equals new townsfolk user options. NPC options dot species equals species. NPC options equals NPC options new townsfolk user options. There. And that makes absolutely certain that that thing is never null. The townsperson will have their species set to whatever. Here's where I go. String actual species equals generated NPC dot species string dot empty. I'm going to rename this to expected species. Engage. Do that. Do that. The generated NPC did not have the requested species. Now, I am going to pause the stream for just a minute because I've had a whole lot of coffee. And when I build a query, how many variables is too many to have reusable? I'll answer that question when I get back, but I do need to step away for just a short minute, and then I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Okay, so CFilms asks, when you build a query, how many variables is too many to have reusable? And it's really hard to give a answer that applies 100% of the time to a question like that. A rule of thumb that I have, at least for code, is if I end up with a method that has more than 3 or 4 parameters, I tend to want to collapse those parameters that need to get passed into the method into some sort of object or some sort of class or a structure or whatever, just to keep the parameter signatures sensible. In terms of a query, I mean, I've seen queries with a dozen or 2 dozen variables or parameters get passed into the stored procedure or the SQL query or whatever, and sometimes, like in some advanced data analysis scenarios or filtering or searching or what have you, that's perfectly valid. The challenge is in structuring the code in a way that that keeps yourself in a day's time or the rest of your development team from losing their minds every time they have to interact with that query. You could pass a collection of parameters around your system if you have to. I like to use a filter object. I haven't implemented one yet here. Well, I've implemented one, but it's only got like a couple of parameters on it. I've built really complex filter clause collections where you can and some and or some and group them together so that, you know, it says, so all of these statements must be true, or all of these statements must be true, or you can do any of these statements in this group can be true, but all of the statements in this group must be true, kind of stuff. And so your current team is you, so you're in the same boat as me right now. So again, it's case by case basis. If I'm dealing with so many variables that it's hard to think about, then I'm going to try to find a way to collapse that giant list of variables into some sort of single conceptual entity that's easier to keep in my brain. From a maintenance point of view, any more than 5 is usually my upper limit. I frequently go even more draconian than that, and if it's more than 3 or 4, I'll collapse to a class. So let's see. I'm going to build my test thing again. Let's take a look. Those are all generated. Let's go ahead and run to see what happens. So random NPC with user selections. We've got 5 different scenarios. Let's go ahead and run it. And once this works, oh yeah, that failed miserably. Let's find out. Excuse me. Random NPCs with user selections. Species. And the options are sent to the townsfolk manager. So we need to add this because I never invoked the actual generate thing. So let's define this step, copy it to the clipboard, pop into my step def. When the options are sent to the townsfolk manager. Generated NPC equals test class dot generate townsperson from options, passing options. There we go. I'm going to say NPC options equals NPC options, but if it's null, build me a new one. There we go. Let's try running this guy again. Okay, good. So there's that. And what that means is I can get rid of the return value species will be elf. Different occupation queries with only the cities are reusable variable, or I have one query where both city and occupation are reusable. What language are you working in? Are you in the .NET space C films? Because if you're in the .NET core space, PHP and SQL, okay. So I don't know the ins and outs of constructing SQL queries inside PHP. In .NET with Link and Entity Framework Core, we have the concept of an iQueryable, which allows you to basically build up a query in code, and then when you execute that query against your data source, it translates the C# and Link code into SQL. And when you use an iQueryable, it doesn't execute until you say like .toList or give me the first one or whatever, until you access the collection of results. And that gives you an awful lot of flexibility in terms of generating your where clause based on the filter data that comes in, whether it's null, whether it has a value, whether it has an empty string. Because as I'm sure you're aware, just talking about string variable or string data types, a zero length empty string has a completely different meaning from null. Null basically in database terms or SQL terms means, I don't know. It doesn't mean empty string. It doesn't mean zero. It doesn't mean false. It means, nobody's told me yet. So you got to be really careful with nulls. But what I've done in the past where I've actually had to build up the actual SQL query as a string is I've looked at my collection of filter clauses that I pass in, or just your raw parameter list if you're using, like just a list of parameters in the PHP. And actually figured out a way to create the string fragments that represent each parameter, and then I'll concatenate the different strings together to form the actual SQL string that's sent into the database to be executed. I've done it that way. You want to be really, really careful doing that. I see you're using bind parameters, so it's a little less scary from a security standpoint. Bind parameters do offer you some protection from SQL injection attacks. But just build it up manually in code, one clause at a time. In that case, is the best advice that I'd have for you. So we're able to do species. Now, I wonder how it would work if I pass null. Let's add one more row here. Oops. Paste again, and instead of gnome, I pass null. And this is where we're getting really complicated, because when we have a null value as a selected attribute, then that means it needs to be populated randomly. So how can we do that? So set the telescope manager. Well, I also want to see what happens when we get to null. So let's build. I want to debug this one. This might get, I might have to do something dumb here. I can roll using system. Blah, 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 blah. End of stack. Serial cleanup async. What are you complaining about here? 35. Standard out. No matching step definition for this step. Ah. Okay, so let's see if there's something about passing null values in examples. Still unique headers, using duplicate headers will result in errors. Multi-line step arguments. Apple T. Use null values in rec roll examples. Number of helpers implemented, create instance T. Yeah. Horizontal tables. Import, use the create set T method described below to create a collection of objects. More than one data row is needed. Yeah. Remember the property name should match values in the table in your scenario. Map a table to a custom class you write. The following example will map the table as described above in the vertical or horizontal layouts. First, create the class. Okay, so we've got that. Property name should match values in the table in your scenario. Properties to both a public getter and a public setter. Okay. Many more. Okay. Interesting. So this data table concept. Following data into the new account form. Data table, blah, 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 blah. Horizontal tables, vertical tables. Excuse me. This layout is desirable for tables containing many values, making the vertical layout easier to read. Yeah. How about nullables, you fools? Compare to instance, compare to set. Binding, account steps, blah, blah, blah. Sets in order matters, column naming, aliasing. This is really rich. Null value retriever. Step definitions, use step argument conversions instead. For test run, register, null value retriever. Null? Null value. Aha! Okay. So this is what I have to do to take in nulls. Let's do this. I'm going to copy that. Pull this over here. And that's in before test run. I'm going to swing up here. Public void. Public static void before test run. I'm going to paste a Roni pizza that. Nope. Not that. Copy and paste. Here we go. And I'm going to use this for null. So we'll come out here, paste that like so. Whoops, drop that. There we go. And let's try running it again. Debug. See if it'll actually build for me. Debug. Okay, species. No. That doesn't give me what I wanted. Stop. That didn't work. So, private const null string null token equals null. We'll run down here. I'll get rid of it. That could be part of my problem. Before test run. That could be the issue. And I've got a call coming in about 10 minutes. So I am going to try this one more time. What did I do? It's trying to run. It's losing its mind. Is it building? Build solution. Try that. All right. Found a whole bunch of tests. Let's just run the Townsfolk Manager tests. Here we go. Now that threw up. It didn't like that. Let's not look at this. It could not apply species template for null. Okay. That's fine. Because there's that. And let's debug that one. It says null. So it's not converting that to an actual null value. So rather than rely on that thing that doesn't appear to be working, we'll get rid of that. And down here, if species equals null token, species equals null. And then down here, townsperson will have their species set to all we're going to do is if expected species is not equal to null token, we'll test that. Else, assert dot not assert dot true, no, false, derp, string dot is null or white space. Copy, paste, actual species. Save. Run. So when null is passed for species, I just want any non-null value. But when something specific is passed for species, I want that exact value back. And one of these failed. And its user provides some attributes because I ripped out a bunch of those things. But we're just going to get rid of that scenario because it's now redundant. Save. And now I can extend this to also supply background invocation in the same scenario outline, just by adding additional whens and thens. And I'm going to do that offline. And that will give me a whole lot more coverage on the townsfolk manager and its random generation capability. And when I get into adding more things that it can generate and supply around a townsperson, that's going to make my life a whole lot easier making those modifications without breaking anything that's already in place. So I do need to run. I'm quite a bit more over time than I intended to be, but I think we covered some interesting topics today, especially around simple refactoring, code cleanliness, making sure we're not hurting ourselves while we're fixing other problems, stuff like that. So I do not have a stream tomorrow morning. I do have another job interview. I intend to be back online tomorrow afternoon around 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So until then, take care of yourselves. Thanks for joining me, and happy coding. Bye now.